Number 1. Travis Eugene Posey. It was an ordinary Friday morning. Families were picking up groceries. A man was buying steak for his weekly Sunday dinner. A nurse was shopping on her day off. And somewhere in that same parking lot, a 44-year-old landscaping contractor sat behind the wheel of a pickup truck, wearing a bandolier loaded with shotgun shells, and waited. Nobody noticed him. Why would they? Fordyce, Arkansas sits 65 miles south of Little Rock in Dallas County. In 2024, its population was roughly 3,200 people. It is the kind of town where everyone recognizes a familiar face and strangers tend to stand out. The Mad Butcher supermarket wasn't just the most popular store in the area. It was the only grocery store in Fordyce. One building, one community, no alternative. For a town that small, that store was the beating heart of daily life. Travis Eugene Posey came from New Edinburgh, a dot on the map even smaller than Fordyce, a community of about 150 people located southeast of town. By most accounts, Posey was unremarkable, a landscaping contractor who worked with his hands, moved through his days without drawing attention, and had no prior incarcerations in the state of Arkansas. No criminal record on file, no warning flags raised, no documented history that would have placed him on anyone's radar in the weeks or months leading up to June 21st, 2024. What was happening inside his mind during that period remains, to this day, unanswered. Investigators have never publicly disclosed a motive. His legal team offered nothing. And when he finally faced the people whose lives he had destroyed, he sat still, stared forward, and said absolutely nothing. That silence would speak louder than any explanation. At approximately 11:38 in the morning, on a clear Friday in June, calls began flooding the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, reporting an active shooter at the Mad Butcher. The first person shot was 50-year-old Roy Sturgis, who had just stepped out of the store after buying steaks for a family dinner. He never made it to his car. Sturgis was struck in the parking lot near U.S. Route 79, just feet from the entrance he had used a few minutes earlier. Posey had come prepared. He stepped out of his truck carrying a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol holstered at his side, and a bandolier draped across his chest that held dozens of additional rounds. This was not an impulsive act. The equipment alone demonstrated a level of premeditation that investigators found deeply troubling. He moved deliberately, first through the parking lot, then through the doors of the store, firing without hesitation at anyone in his path. Inside the Mad Butcher, the scene turned to chaos. Customers screamed, employees ran. Families with children sprinted toward back corridors and storage rooms. One group, with no clear exit route, piled into a walk-in freezer and pulled the door shut, pressed together in the cold and the dark, listening to the gunfire echo through the building. A 39-year-old mother later recalled hearing what she estimated to be 9 or 10 shots before she reached the freezer. Her daughter and son, who had been in a different aisle, found her moments later and were guided in behind her by store employees. Among those inside was 23-year-old Callie Weems. She was a registered nurse at the nearby Dallas County Medical Center and had come to the store simply because it was her day off and she needed groceries. When the shooting began, Weems did not run toward the back. She moved toward the injured. She was attempting to render aid to victims when she was shot and killed. She was 23 years old. Fordyce police and Dallas County Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes. What followed was a 2-minute exchange of gunfire in the parking lot between law enforcement and Travis Posey. 2 officers were wounded during that confrontation. Dallas County Sheriff Mike Knoble was among those who held B. Lying against the gunman while people inside the store scrambled to safety. Posey was struck by gunfire, a graze wound to the head, before being taken into custody. The active shooter situation was over in under 5 minutes from the first reported shots. When officers approached the wounded Posey after his arrest, he reportedly told them that God had been with him that morning. 4 people did not survive. Roy Sturgis, 50, Callie Weems, 23, Shirley Taylor, 52, and 81-year-old Ellen Shrum, who was shot inside the store and died the following morning on June 22nd. Ellen Shrum's family later said she was the kind of woman who would have helped Posey herself, had he simply asked. 11 others were injured, several seriously. The shooting became the deadliest active shooter incident in the United States in the entire calendar year of 2024. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders ordered flags lowered to half-staff across the state and called it a tragedy for the whole of Arkansas. At trial, the families of the victims were unanimous on one point. They did not want the death penalty. They wanted certainty. They wanted to know he would never be free, never burden them again beyond the weight of their own memories. On August 4th, 2025, Circuit Court Judge Spencer Singleton sentenced Travis Eugene Posey to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 220 years for 11 counts of attempted capital murder. When the judge asked if Posey had anything to say, he shook his head and replied quietly, "No, sir. The only grocery store in Fordyce reopened 11 days after the massacre because a town of 3,200 people cannot survive without somewhere to buy food, no matter what happened inside those walls. And while Fordyce began the long, painful work of rebuilding something that may never fully heal, another case was unfolding in Arkansas. One that proved that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is wearing a badge. Number. He's 2. Grant Harden. The badge is supposed to mean something. It is supposed to represent accountability, service, a line drawn between order and chaos. For most of the people who carry one, it does. But every so often, a man spends his entire career hiding behind that symbol, collecting power, dodging consequences, moving from town to town whenever the walls start closing in. Grant Harden spent decades doing exactly that. And even after the walls finally did close, literally, he found a way to walk straight through them. Harden grew up in the rugged Ozark foothills of northwest Arkansas, a landscape of limestone ridges, river valleys, and small communities, where a familiar face means everything and a badge means even more. By his own account, and by the accounts of those who knew him in his younger years, he was unremarkable, quiet, just one of the local kids, a man who blended into the fabric of wherever he happened to be. That ability to blend, to project normalcy while concealing something darker underneath, would define him for the next 3.5 decades. His law enforcement career began in Fayetteville, where he was hired as a patrol officer. It ended almost before it started. His supervisors documented problems immediately. He was dismissed, but instead of removing him from consideration across the region, that termination seemed to barely register. Harden was hired by the Huntsville Police Department, where he worked for about 6 months before resigning. He then moved to Eureka Springs, where he served from 1993 to 1996. His chief there, Earl Hyatt, later said he had been preparing to fire Harden over incidents that included the use of excessive force. Before that could happen, Harden resigned. Hyatt did not mince words in the years that followed. He told reporters plainly that Harden did not need to be a police officer at all. The pattern was clear: get hired, create problems, leave before accountability arrived, rinse and repeat. By 2016, Harden had landed in Gateway, Arkansas, a town of roughly 450 people tucked near the Missouri border in Benton County. He was appointed police chief. For a community that small, the police chief is not an abstract institutional figure. It is someone your neighbors know, someone you trust with your safety. Harden held that position for 4 months. 4 months was apparently long enough to settle a grievance. On February 23rd, 2017, 59-year-old James Appleton was driving down a road approximately half a mile from his home in Garfield, just outside Gateway. Appleton worked for the Gateway Water Department, a quiet, working-class job, the kind that keeps a small town running without fanfare. Police found his body inside his car. He had been shot in the head. He never had the opportunity to defend himself or understand what was happening to him. Investigators moved quickly. Grant Harden, by then working as a corrections officer at the Northwest Arkansas Community Correction Center in Fayetteville, was identified as the suspect. Records indicate he and Appleton had a history of disputes. The precise nature of those disputes, the specific friction between them, was detailed in the HBO documentary that would later be made about Harden, titled Devil in the Ozarks. In October 2017, Harden pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Most people assumed that was the end, But when Hardin's DNA was entered into the Arkansas statewide database following his murder conviction, investigators received a match that sent shockwaves through the entire case. The DNA linked Hardin to the 1997 rape of a schoolteacher named Amy Harrison in Rogers, Arkansas, a crime that had gone unsolved for more than 2 decades. Investigators had been so determined not to let the case expire that they had applied for a John Doe warrant in 2003 as the statute of limitations approached, preserving the DNA. Profile against the day a match might finally surface. That day came because of a murder. In 2019, Hardin pleaded guilty to 2 counts of rape. He was sentenced to an additional 50 years, with the terms to run consecutively. His total sentence now stood at 80 years. He was moved to the North Central Unit in Calico Rock, a medium security facility in the rocky heart of the Ozark Mountains. And then, on May 25, 2025, Grant Hardin walked out. He did not tunnel. He did not cut through wire or overpower a guard. He walked through the front, through a secured gate, wearing a fake uniform he had spent 6 months constructing from materials gathered in the prison kitchen: black pants, a black shirt, black cap, a vest-like garment, and a fake badge fashioned from the lid of a metal can colored with Sharpie markers. He had hidden the pieces at the bottom of a trash can in the kitchen because, as he later told investigators, nobody ever shook it down. He had also built a wooden ladder from pallets in case he needed to scale the fence. He did not need it. When he approached the gate, he simply directed the tower officer to open it, and the officer did, without verifying his identity. A prison spokesperson called it a lapse. A legislative subcommittee called it a systemic failure. 2 employees were fired. Several others were suspended. Hardin walked out into the Arkansas wilderness, carrying food smuggled from the kitchen and water distilled from his CPAP machine, and disappeared into the Ozarks. Tracking dogs lost his scent almost immediately when heavy rain swept through the area. Drones could not fly. Helicopters were grounded. The terrain, rocky, cave-riddled, thick with old outbuildings, was the kind of landscape that could swallow a man whole if he knew it well enough. A local cafe owner who knew Hardin in his younger years told reporters he was a very smart man and that he knew where the caves were. The FBI and U.S. Marshals issued a combined $25,000 reward. Communities across Izard County were told to lock their doors and vehicles. The sister of James Appleton, Cheryl Tillman, who by then had become the mayor of Gateway, told CNN her family was terrified. They had testified against him. He had seen their faces in that courtroom. 11 days later, on June 6, 2025, tracking dogs picked up a scent near Moccasin Creek in Izard County, roughly a mile and a half west of the prison. Officers moved in. Hardin briefly tried to run when he saw them approach, but he had been surviving in the wilderness for nearly 2 weeks and had nothing left. He was tackled to the ground and taken into custody. He was confirmed through fingerprints. A spokesperson captured the moment on his cell phone. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders confirmed his recapture within the hour. When it was over, Cheryl Tillman said she and her family had spent every day of that manhunt watching their backs. Now, she said, they could breathe. The man who wore a badge, killed a neighbor, assaulted a teacher, and then walked out of prison disguised as the very kind of authority figure he had corrupted, was back behind the walls he had briefly escaped. In the Ozarks, they still call him the Devil. And as Arkansas continued to reckon with the damage left by men who should have known better, another case was waiting. One where the monster didn't hide behind a uniform, but behind something far more ordinary. A friendly smile and an open house sign. Number 3, Aaron Lewis. She recorded a 12-second message begging her husband to cooperate. He did not hear it until after she was already gone. Beverly Carter was, by every account, a woman who poured herself into her work. A grandmother from Central Arkansas, she had built her career in real estate through persistence, warmth, and an absolute willingness to show up. She worked for Cry Leak Realtors in North Little Rock, and in 2013, she had sold $12 million worth of property. By September 2014, things had slowed. She and her husband Carl had hit a rough patch financially, enough that she had to skip a real estate convention in Florida. But Beverly kept going. She kept scheduling showings, kept answering calls from prospective buyers, kept showing up alone to empty houses because that was the job. And she believed in doing it right. That dedication, that willingness to meet a stranger at an isolated property without hesitation, is what Aaron Lewis was counting on. Lewis was 33 years old and living in Jacksonville, Arkansas, a small city just northeast of Little Rock. He and his estranged wife, Crystal Lowry, were in desperate financial circumstances and had settled on a scheme to generate quick money, kidnap a real estate agent, hold her for ransom, and collect from a worried spouse before law enforcement could close in. The plan required someone who would show up alone, someone whose disappearance would take time to trigger alarm, someone whose profession put them in empty rural properties on short notice. They went looking for a married woman who worked in real estate by herself. In the afternoon of September 25th, 2014, Beverly Carter received what appeared to be a routine inquiry. A prospective buyer wanted to view a property at 14,202 Old River Drive in Scott, Arkansas, a rural address outside Little Rock. Beverly told her husband by phone that she was heading to the showing. She did not return. When Carl Carter arrived at the property around 9 that evening, after not hearing from her, he found Beverly's SUV parked in the driveway. Her purse was still inside. The front door to the house was standing open. Beverly was gone. What followed was a 4-day search involving hundreds of volunteers, fellow realtors combing the surrounding land on foot and by ATV, and the full resources of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office. Investigators pieced together that Lewis had made contact with Beverly using a false identity. He and Lowry had selected the Old River Drive property deliberately, isolated, no neighbors close enough to witness anything, and far enough from the main road that no one would hear a struggle. Lewis had taken Beverly from the property and placed her in the trunk of his car, bound with duct tape. The plan, as Crystal Lowry would later testify, was to hold Beverly at an abandoned office building on the grounds of the Argos Concrete Company in Cabot, a facility where Lewis had previously worked and knew the layout. They would secure her there, make ransom demands, collect the money, and release her. But the plan collapsed before it could begin. The building was no longer accessible in the way Lewis had anticipated. With Beverly bound in his trunk and nowhere to take her, he improvised. Lewis brought Beverly to his Jacksonville home. Lowry guarded her in the bathroom with a stun gun, while Lewis drove back to the Old River Drive property to retrieve Beverly's purse and bank card. When he arrived, he found law enforcement already swarming the scene. He left empty-handed and returned home. The couple forced Beverly to record a brief ransom message, 12 seconds, her voice pleading with Carl to cooperate. Then they faced a decision. Lowry later testified that they had concluded Beverly had already seen Lewis's face and may have seen Lowry's name on prescription bottles inside the bathroom. Releasing her was no longer part of the calculation. Beverly Carter was killed by suffocation. She was then transported to the Argos Concrete facility and buried in a shallow grave in the darkness behind the plant, a location only Lewis knew about, a place tied to his past, chosen because he believed no one would look there. For 4 days, no one did. On the morning of September 30th, investigators zeroed in on Lewis. Cell phone data had been quietly building a trail. A warrant was issued. Lewis was arrested after being injured in a vehicle accident in Pulaski County. Investigators believe he may have been attempting to flee. He was transported to Baptist Health Medical Center, then taken in for questioning. He was questioned for more than 12 hours. He admitted to kidnapping Beverly. He would not say where she was. At one point, he told investigators he had a co-defendant named Trevor, a name that turned out to be a dead end. He reportedly said he was sorry. Then he stopped talking. In the early hours of the following morning, after prolonged questioning, Lewis finally led investigators to the Argos Concrete Company in Cabot. Sheriff's deputies got down on their hands and knees in the middle of the night and carefully excavated Beverly Carter's body from the shallow grave. She was identified. Her husband and 2 sons were notified in person. When Lewis was walked out of the sheriff's office that day, reporters asked him directly why he had targeted Beverly Carter. He paused, and then, without hesitation or apparent remorse, he said she was a woman that worked alone, a rich broker. 7 words, delivered casually, almost matter-of-factly, to a crowd of journalists. It became one of the most chilling statements to emerge from any Arkansas crime case in years. The trial opened in January 2016. Lewis testified in his own defense, claiming that Beverly had died accidentally during a consensual encounter and blaming her death on Crystal Lowry. Lowry, who had already pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping in exchange for a reduced 30-year sentence, took the stand for the prosecution and flatly denied it. The defense's argument was immediately undermined by the duct tape, by the ransom recording, by the grave, and by the very logic of what prosecutors laid out methodically before the jury. The judge had excluded significant portions of evidence due to documented law enforcement missteps during the investigation, including statements Lewis had made to police and items found in his vehicle, among them Carter's hair and duct tape. Despite those limitations, the prosecution built a case strong enough that the jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty of capital murder and kidnapping. Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case sent shockwaves through the real estate industry nationwide. Agents across the country began revisiting their safety protocols, requiring buddy systems, sharing location data before showings, verifying identities before meeting strangers at empty properties. Beverly Carter's murder changed how an entire profession thought about vulnerability. In May 2024, Aaron Lewis filed a court document asserting a new identity. The filing attracted brief attention, but did not alter the sentence, the conviction, or the record of what had been done. Beverly Carter sold $12 million in real estate the year before she died. She went to work because she loved what she did. She showed up to an empty house because a stranger asked her to, and because that was what her job required of her. That trust cost her everything. Coming up, another Arkansas case that shook the entire nation, where 3 teenagers were convicted of a crime many believed they did not commit, and where the fight for truth would last nearly 2 decades before the world finally started paying attention. Number 4, the West Memphis 3. 3 8-year-old boys rode their bikes into the woods and never came home. What came next would become one of the most debated miscarriages of justice in American history. A case where the wrong people may have gone to prison, a killer may have walked free, and the system that was supposed to find the truth became part of the problem. On the evening of May 5, 1993, Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch, all second graders at Weaver Elementary School in West Memphis, Arkansas, went out riding together. After school, they were 8 years old. When they didn't return that evening, their parents contacted police. The following afternoon, May 6th, their bodies were discovered submerged in a water-filled drainage ditch behind the Robin Hood Hills subdivision, a muddy stretch of woodland the local children used as a shortcut and a playground. The boys had been beaten. They were naked. They had been hog-tied with their own shoelaces. West Memphis was a working-class community across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. It was a town already under significant stress in 1993, economically struggling, socially fractured, and deeply gripped by a cultural phenomenon that had been building across the country for a decade: satanic panic. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, a wave of fear had swept through American communities. A conviction, stoked by religious organizations, sensational media coverage, and credulous authorities, that devil-worshipping cults were targeting children. By 1993, that fear was embedded in the minds of investigators, prosecutors, and entire communities. And in West Memphis, one man had been cataloging his suspicions about local teenagers for months before those 3 boys ever went missing. Jerry Driver was a juvenile probation officer in Crittenden County. He had become convinced that a satanic cult was operating in the area, a belief rooted largely in his dealings with one teenager named Damian Eccles. Eccles was 18 years old, a high school dropout from a poor background who had been placed under Driver's supervision. He wore black clothes. He listened to heavy metal music. He read Stephen King novels. He had expressed an interest in Wicca and the occult. In the cultural atmosphere of 1993, those traits were enough to make Damian Eccles the first name that surfaced when police began looking for a suspect. Eccles had a close friend named Jason Baldwin, 16, a quiet, academically capable kid who did well in school and shared little of Eccles' interest in the occult. The two were social outsiders who gravitated toward each other. The third name that entered the investigation was Jesse Miskelly Jr., 17, a young man who had little meaningful connection to either Echols or Baldwin. But Jesse Miskelly had something investigators wanted. He was easily manipulated. On June 3, 1993, police brought Miskelly in for questioning. He was 17 years old. His IQ tested at approximately 72. He had no attorney present. His parents were not contacted before the interrogation began. What happened over the next 12 hours would become the fulcrum on which this entire case balanced, and ultimately, the thing that may have destroyed it. After hours of questioning, Miskelly confessed. He said that he, Echols, and Baldwin had killed the three boys as part of a ritual, but the confession was riddled with factual errors that investigators dismissed as confusion. Miskelly said the boys had been sexually assaulted. Forensic evidence did not support that. He said they had been tied with rope. They had been bound with their own shoelaces. He described the attacks occurring in the morning. The boys had last been seen in the late afternoon. An expert on false confessions, Professor Richard Offshee of UC Berkeley, would later testify that what was recorded of Miskelly's interrogation was a textbook example of police coercion. A young man with an intellectual disability repeating back what investigators suggested to him. Miskelly recanted the moment he was released to his family. He said he had been threatened and promised a reward to cooperate. It made no difference. All three teenagers were arrested. The community of West Memphis, traumatized and terrified, was convinced by prosecutors and media that they had found the killers. The trials moved forward. Miskelly was tried separately in January 1994. His attorney argued the confession was coerced and factually inconsistent. The jury deliberated and convicted him. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. The trial of Echols and Baldwin followed. Miskelly refused to testify against them. Without his confession, which was barred from their trial, the prosecution built its case on circumstantial evidence so thin it would be almost unimaginable by today's standards. Echols read Stephen King. He listened to Metallica. A fellow inmate claimed Baldwin had confessed in passing. Two teenage girls claimed they had overheard Echols admit to the murders at a softball game. Expert witnesses testified about alleged satanic ritual elements. The defense attempted to introduce an alternative suspect, a local teenager who had reportedly made statements suggesting his own involvement, but the judge refused to allow the testimony before the jury. On March 18, 1994, Echols and Baldwin were found guilty of capital murder. Echols was sentenced to death. Baldwin received life without parole. They were 18 and 17 years old. The convictions might have faded from public consciousness entirely, if not for a documentary filmmaker. In 1996, Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky released Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, which brought the case to a national audience and raised questions about the fairness of the trials that the legal system had refused to ask. The film was followed by sequels in 2000 and 2012. A support movement grew. Celebrities and musicians held fundraisers. Thousands of people became convinced that three teenagers had been sent to prison, one to death row, based on fear, bad science, and a broken interrogation. Then the science started catching up. In 2007, DNA testing of the crime scene evidence excluded all three men completely. Not only did no genetic material connect Echols, Baldwin, or Miskelly to the victims, the testing detected DNA from an unidentified male. That unknown profile did not match the West Memphis Three. It did not belong to any of the three murdered boys. It belonged to someone else entirely. Simultaneously, a bombshell emerged regarding the original trial. A sworn affidavit revealed that the jury foreman in the Echols-Baldwin trial had made inappropriate contact with an attorney during proceedings and had introduced Miskelly's inadmissible confession into jury deliberations, the very confession that had been barred from that trial. In order to convince fellow jurors to convict, the Arkansas Supreme Court vacated the convictions and ordered new hearings. But Damian Echols had already spent 17 years on death row, scheduled for execution 3 separate times. The prospect of a new trial, unpredictable, expensive, emotionally devastating, felt like another kind of trap. In August 2011, after weeks of negotiation, All three men accepted offered pleas, a rare legal mechanism that allowed each of them to maintain their innocence on the public record while acknowledging prosecutors still had evidence that could theoretically result in conviction at trial. They were sentenced to time served and released with 10-year suspended sentences. They walked out of prison on August 19, 2011. Collectively, they had served 18 years and 78 days. No compensation, no formal exoneration, no new investigation into who left that unidentified DNA at the scene. The murders of Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch remain officially unsolved. The fight is not over. As recently as 2025, evidence has been sent for advanced DNA testing using newly developed extraction methods capable of recovering genetic material from the shoelaces that bound those children, material that could not be fully analyzed in prior rounds of testing. The Arkansas Supreme Court ruled in favor of allowing the testing. As of today, the results are still pending. 3 boys went into those woods and never came home. Whether the people convicted of killing them are the people who actually did it, that question remains open. And in Arkansas, some of the darkest cases are not defined by doubt, but by absolute certainty, like the methodical crimes of a serial killer in Fort Smith, whose victims waited decades before forensic science finally gave them justice. Number 5. Charles Ray Vines. His parents ran a mortuary. He grew up around death the way other children grow up around dinner tables and backyard gardens. Whether that shaped him or whether something else entirely did, is a question that investigators spent years trying to answer, and never fully could. What they do know is this. For nearly 7 years, the River Valley region of northwest Arkansas lived in fear of a killer no one could find, and the man responsible was living quietly among them the entire time, sharing vegetables from his garden, helping out neighbors, attending to his 2 children, and being described by virtually everyone who knew him as a genuinely decent person. Charles Ray Vines was born and raised in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a mid-sized city on the Oklahoma border at the edge of the Ozark foothills. He was the kind of man who blended effortlessly into the fabric of a community. Divorced, a father of 2, hardworking enough to maintain a reputation, sociable enough to be liked. His parents had run a funeral home, a detail that would take on a different weight once investigators understood what Vines was capable of. By his mid-20s, nothing about him raised alarm. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal man living a quiet life in a place where most people knew each other's names. Beneath that surface, Vines had developed a pattern of predatory violence that would not be uncovered for nearly a decade. On April 10, 1993, authorities in Fort Smith were called to the home of Lily Jones, an 89-year-old woman who lived alone despite being legally blind and deeply devout in her faith. She had been attacked inside her own home. Lily Jones survived, but the assault was severe. Investigators documented what had happened, collected evidence, and began searching for a suspect. No credible lead materialized. The case went quiet. 2 months later, in June of 1993, 58-year-old Juanita Wofford was found dead in her home near railroad tracks off Jenny Lind Road in Fort Smith. The scene, by all accounts, was among the most disturbing that seasoned local detectives had ever encountered. Former Fort Smith Police Captain Jay Ryder, who worked the case, would later describe it as the most horrific homicide of his career, the kind you never fully leave behind. The door of the residence had been kicked in. The frame was shattered. Wofford had fought back. Defense marks covered her hands and arms. She had suffered stab wounds to the head and torso. Forensic analysis of her body revealed she had been sexually assaulted. The evidence suggested the attacker had lingered at the scene. DNA was collected. Investigators worked through a list of persons of interest. A local man named Danny Bennett was ultimately identified as a suspect and taken into custody. He denied involvement, then confessed. The community exhaled. Fort Smith believed it had its killer. Then, on August 10, 1995, while Bennett was still behind bars, 74-year-old Ruth Henderson was found murdered in Crawford County, 2 counties over, in a crime scene so similar to the Wofford murder that investigators immediately recognized they had made a catastrophic error. The door, the violence, the forensic profile, it matched. Bennett's DNA was tested and did not connect him to Henderson's death. The evidence from the Wofford scene was retested. It did not match Bennett either. The prosecutor at the time, Ron Fields, had harbored doubts from the beginning. When the Crawford County murder came through, he called police directly. He told them they had the wrong man. Months later, they called him back and confirmed it. Danny Bennett was released. The real killer was still out there. The Wofford case went cold. The Henderson case went cold. And Lily Jones's assault, now understood to be the part of the same pattern, went cold with them. 5 years passed. The River Valley region, spanning Sebastian and Crawford counties, lived uneasily with the knowledge that someone among them had killed at least twice and remained completely undetected. In March of 2000, the investigation broke open, not through forensic analysis or detective work, but through chance. A 16-year-old girl was attacked inside her family home by a man her parents knew, Charles Ray Vines, a family acquaintance and friend. When her stepfather arrived home during the assault, he found Vines and physically overpowered him, holding him until police arrived. A deputy reached the scene before the stepfather, by his own later account, could complete the justice he intended to deliver himself. Vines was 36 years old. He was charged with rape and attempted murder. And then, investigators ran his DNA against the evidence collected from the Wofford and Henderson crime scenes. The match was exact. Perfect on all points. Charles Ray Vines, the man sharing vegetables with neighbors, the divorced father, the man whose parents had run a mortuary, had been the River Valley killer the entire time. The investigation that followed was as methodical as Vines himself had been predatory. The new prosecutor elected not to pursue the death penalty in exchange for Vines' full cooperation. For 5 days, in 8-hour sessions, Captain Jay Ryder sat across from Charles Ray Vines and listened to him describe what he had done. Ryder later told reporters that the content of those conversations was not something he would repeat on local news. He said it was the most trying experience of his professional life. Vines confessed to the assault on Lily Jones, the murders of Juanita Wofford and Ruth Henderson, and the attack on the 16-year-old girl. He had known some of his victims personally. He had operated in plain sight for 7 years. He had watched an innocent man be arrested for one of his crimes, observed proceedings from a safe distance, and continued living his life as though none of it had happened. In 2001, Vines was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder, residential burglary, and rape. Circuit Court judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would never breathe free air again. Vines died of natural causes in September 2019, while incarcerated at the Arkansas Department of Corrections Maximum Security Unit. He was 55 years old. Investigators would later attempt to question him about another unsolved case, the 1994 disappearance and murder of a young woman named Melissa Witt in Fort Smith. But Vines died before those questions could be fully pursued. That case remains open. It remains, like so many things connected to Charles Ray Vines, unresolved. His case was featured on Investigation Discovery's Murder by Numbers and later on, Oxygen Snap Notorious. The River Valley Killer. The documentaries brought national attention to crimes that Fort Smith had lived with quietly for years. 7 years, 4 known victims, 3 life sentences, and a man who shared his garden vegetables while investigators searched for a monster they could not find. The next case on our list involves a very different kind of moment. Not a crime that unfolded over years, but a phone call that ended a life and a conversation that may have ended a case before it ever got to court. Number 6, Shauna Cash. She had been awake for 3 weeks, running on methamphetamine, paranoia, and a pattern of decisions she had been making her whole life. On the morning of June 26, 2021, she told her brother later, all she had planned to do was get gas, so she could drive to Pine Bluff to pick up her belongings from an ex-boyfriend's house. That was the plan. Simple, ordinary, inconsequential. By noon, a Pea Ridge police officer was dead. Shauna Ray Cash was 22 years old on the day she killed Kevin Apple. She had grown up moving between Arkansas and Arizona, raised by a young mother without resources, shuttled through a childhood that DHS reports would later describe in terms of infected tick bites, missed school days, absent glasses, and documented allegations of physical and sexual abuse. She had a brother named Chris who went through much of the same. He came out the other side employed, married, and raising 5 children. Shauna came out the other side, addicted to methamphetamine and running from police. And she had run before. More than once, records showed that in 2020, she had led Farmington police on a high-speed pursuit. Months later, she had fled from Fayetteville officers. By the time June 2021 arrived, the prosecutor who would eventually stand before her jury would say it plainly. Shauna Cash was more experienced, with high-speed chases than the officer chasing her. That morning began with a stolen mail check. A Rogers man noticed a blue Jeep Cherokee pull up to his mailbox and take something from it. He got in his car and followed the Jeep, honking until it pulled into a Walgreens parking lot. He confronted the driver, Shauna Cash, and she returned the mailed check. But when the man felt threatened by her passenger, 21-year-old Elijah Andazola, reaching towards something, he drew his own firearm and told them both to get out of the vehicle while he called police. As sirens became audible in the distance, Cash and Andazola climbed back into the Jeep and drove away. Rogers police alerted Pea Ridge. At approximately 12:09 in the afternoon, Pea Ridge police officer Kevin Apple and another officer, Brian Stamps, located the blue Jeep Cherokee parked at the White Oak gas station on North Missouri Street. What happened next was captured in full by surveillance cameras, footage without audio, but with a clarity that left nothing to interpretation. Officer Apple exited his patrol vehicle. According to witnesses, he told Cash not to move. The camera showed him approaching the front of the Jeep. 7 seconds after he stepped out of his cruiser, Cash threw the vehicle into reverse, slamming backwards into Officer Stamps' patrol car. Apple, positioned at the front of the Jeep with his service weapon drawn, was now directly in her path. 3 seconds later, Cash accelerated forward. The vehicle struck Apple at full force and carried him on the hood for several feet before she steered slightly right and pinned him between her Jeep and Apple's patrol car. She did not stop. She continued accelerating. Officer Kevin Apple was dragged underneath the Jeep for 149 feet, roughly half the length of a football field, as Cash drove out of camera range. He was still alive when the dragging began. The forensic pathologist who testified at trial confirmed it. He was alive and sustaining injuries beneath the vehicle as it moved. He did not survive. Cash and Andazola fled toward Bella Vista. Officers from multiple agencies, Pea Ridge, Rogers, the Benton County Sheriff's Office, Arkansas State Police, converged on the area. The pair were eventually located and taken into custody after their vehicle crashed. Andazola attempted to run on foot and was found hiding in a camper trailer. Both were booked into the Benton County Jail. Kevin Apple was 40 years old. The community of Pea Ridge, shattered, held vigils. Law enforcement agencies from across the region attended his funeral procession. His mother, Daylene Hart, released a public statement describing a void she said was simply unexplainable, and expressing her faith that justice would come. Now, here is where the case takes a turn that no defense attorney wanted. The Benton County Jail, like virtually every detention facility in the country, records inmate telephone calls and plays an audible automated disclaimer at the start of every conversation, informing both parties that the call may be monitored and recorded. Shauna Cash knew this. Everyone in custody knows this. And yet, in the months following her arrest, she made call after call from that jail. Calls that would eventually be played in open court before a jury deciding whether she lived or died. In one call, made to an unidentified man, Cash laughed. She told him she couldn't believe she had gone worldwide. She talked about being on the news, on Facebook, on wanted posters hung at Walmart. She told him her name was everywhere. Her companion on the call finished her sentence for her. "Criminal," he said. She laughed again. In a second recorded call, Cash spoke with her older brother, Chris. This was December 2021, 6 months after Apple's death, as she awaited trial. She told Chris she had been awake for 3 weeks on methamphetamine before the incident. She said she'd had a gut feeling that morning not to run because there was already a lookout bulletin from Rogers Police. But that, being herself, she had gotten away from police anyway. She laughed at that too. She discussed her legal strategy, how her attorneys had reviewed the video, initially explored arguments for lesser charges, and then seen the footage and immediately shifted to considering capital murder. She discussed what she believed could and could not be proven. She said it, all of it, on a recorded jail call. Defense attorneys at trial argued that Cash had not intended to kill Apple, that she was not aware she was dragging him, and that the initial impact was not the cause of death. The forensic pathologist confirmed the initial strike alone was not fatal, but he also confirmed Apple was alive and sustaining lethal injuries during the dragging that followed. The prosecution argued the vehicle was a weapon, that the pattern of flight was deliberate, and that the phone calls demonstrated the character of someone who laughed at a man's death from the relative comfort of a jail cell. On February 8, 2024, after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Shauna Ray Cash guilty of capital murder, fleeing, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and obstruction of governmental operations. The sentencing phase that followed allowed the defense to introduce Cash's childhood, the abuse, the neglect, the methamphetamine addiction, the mental health history, as mitigating factors against the death penalty. Ultimately, the jury recommended life in prison without parole. Judge Brad Caron formally sentenced Cash to life, plus an additional 17 years for the remaining charges. She appealed. In February of 2026, the Arkansas Supreme Court reviewed the case, acknowledged that one piece of evidence, details about a prior stolen key fob, should not have been admitted at trial, but ruled the error was harmless and did not affect the verdict. The conviction was affirmed and officially closed. The jail phone, calls Cash had been so casual about making, those were ruled admissible. In fact, her own defense team had requested they be played in court as part of their strategy. The Supreme Court noted the irony without dwelling on it. Kevin Apple's mother said she believed in the criminal justice system. It answered her. The next case also involves betrayal, but not the kind that explodes in a gas station parking lot. This one was quiet, calculated, and unfolded inside the most trusted relationship a person can have, a best friend. Number 7, Rebecca O'Donnell. She was on her way to the memorial service when they arrested her. That detail alone tells you something about Rebecca O'Donnell, about the particular kind of calculated cold-bloodedness that defined every decision she made in the weeks after May 28, 2019. She had killed her best friend, she had hidden the body, she had gone home. And then, when the community of Pocahontas, Arkansas, gathered to mourn the woman she had, murdered, she dressed, got in the car, and drove toward the service as though she had every right to be there. Sheriff Kevin Bell and his deputies pulled her over before she arrived. Linda Collins Smith had spent the better part of a decade at the center of Arkansas political life. She was a Republican state senator representing the 19th District. A businesswoman, a community figure, a woman who had built her identity around ambition and public service and the kind of relentless forward momentum that small-town politics demands. She had served in the Arkansas House from 2011 to 2013, switched parties from Democrat to Republican, and won a state Senate seat in 2014. She was a member of the NRA, the Arkansas Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club. She fought hard on legislation she believed in and made enemies accordingly. She was also, by the accounts of those closest to her, a deeply loyal woman, the kind who trusted people fully once they had earned that trust. Rebecca O'Donnell had spent years earning it. The two women had known each other for most of their lives, growing up in the same community in Randolph County. O'Donnell had worked as a campaign aide when Colin Smith was building her political career, and over time, that professional relationship had deepened into what people around them described as a sisterhood. O'Donnell was close enough to Colin Smith that she served as a witness during the senator's divorce proceedings from her ex-husband Phil Smith, a former judge, in what had become an intensely contentious separation involving significant financial stakes. O'Donnell was not just a friend, she was a confidant, a business partner, and the person Linda turned to when the world became difficult. She also, according to investigators, had been quietly forging Linda's signature on checks and stealing money from the accounts they shared through a hotel the two women jointly owned. By 2019, Colin Smith had lost her Senate seat after redistricting. She was working to relaunch her political career, had recently traveled to Washington, D.C. to make connections that might help her return to the legislature, and was dealing simultaneously with the ongoing fallout from her divorce. Those who knew her said she came home from that Washington trip with renewed purpose. She had made it home safely. Her son Butch knew this, and then she simply went silent. A week passed, text messages went unanswered. Social media, which Colin Smith maintained actively, went dark. When Butch and his grandfather drove to the home in Pocahontas and walked the property, they found her car in the driveway. Her suitcase was still inside the house with the luggage tag still attached. Her purse and phone were missing, and on the kitchen floor, there was a dark stain, a semicircle, like something had been dropped and sprayed outward from a central point. It was blood. Linda Collins Smith's body was found covered by a tarp in her own driveway. The state of decomposition after days beneath that covering in an Arkansas summer was severe enough that investigators could not immediately make a positive identification from visual examination alone. Her son made the 911 call. It was the last memory he said he would carry of his mother. The original case file was sealed by the presiding judge, which fueled immediate speculation and mistrust throughout the community. Rumors circulated. Had it been Phil Smith, the former judge and bitter ex-husband? Had someone from Colin Smith's political past arranged the killing? Media organizations, including KARK, eventually filed a lawsuit under Arkansas Freedom of Information Act provisions to have the file released. When they succeeded, the documents that emerged told a very different story. Colin Smith had installed security cameras on her property. O'Donnell apparently knew this, and after the killing, she tampered with the cameras, physically removing them from the premises. What she did not know was that the security system had already transmitted footage to a remote server maintained by the company. Investigators subpoenaed that footage. What they saw in those recordings was Rebecca O'Donnell at the property, holding a bloody knife, and then dismantling the cameras she believed would condemn her. She was arrested on June 14, 2019, 10 days after Linda's body was found, while en route to the memorial service. She was charged with capital murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Prosecutors announced their intent to seek the death penalty. For over a year, O'Donnell maintained her innocence. She pointed investigators toward Phil Smith. She told her fiancé, Tim Loggins, who stood by her and publicly declared her incapable of the crime, that she had been set up. Loggins was a man who had known O'Donnell for years. He said she had been the last person to see Linda alive, the two having gone to lunch together on May 28th. He said their relationship was like sisters. He said he would stake everything on her innocence. While in custody at the Jackson County Jail, O'Donnell was not idle. Investigators obtained video footage from inside the facility showing her passing notes to fellow inmates. Those notes, prosecutors said, described a murder-for-hire operation. O'Donnell allegedly solicited inmates to kill Phil Smith and make the death look like a suicide, complete with a staged note, and to also eliminate the judge overseeing her case and the prosecutors pursuing it. She allegedly told the inmates to steal gold and silver from Smith's home as payment, and to find her car in police custody and burn it to destroy what she claimed was planted evidence. Numerous judges and prosecutors recused themselves from the case over the course of 13 months. The case churned with conflicts of interest and procedural complications that baffled even seasoned Arkansas legal observers. Then, on August 6, 2020, Rebecca C. O'Donnell walked into court and changed her plea. "I went to Linda's house," she told the judge, her voice recorded and broadcast across the state, "and I intentionally killed her and then hid the body." 14 words, no elaboration, no explanation. Just the plain, clinical admission of what she had done to the woman described as her best friend. The motive, as later confirmed by Colin Smith's son, Butch, was money. O'Donnell had been stealing from Linda, forging her signature on checks, draining accounts, taking what was not hers. When Colin Smith confronted her about the theft, O'Donnell had not apologized or confessed or offered to make it right. She had gone to Linda's house on May 28th and stabbed her to death. O'Donnell was sentenced to 40 years for first-degree murder, 3 years for abuse of a corpse, and 7 years each for 2 counts of solicitation to commit capital murder, all terms running to a combined 50 years. She is currently held at a women's correctional facility in Newport, Arkansas. She will be eligible for parole, though Colin Smith's family has stated they intend to oppose it at every opportunity. Tim Loggins, the fiancé who had declared her incapable of the crime, released a statement after the plea. He said no one wants to believe someone they love is capable of something so heinous. He said his heart had simply refused to accept what he later learned was true. Linda Collins Smith's daughter said no punishment would ever fill the void. They had found, she said, only a shred of peace. Coming up, another Arkansas case where the evidence waited patiently for years to expose a killer, where GPS data would dismantle a man's alibi in real time, and where a 4-year delay between crime and conviction only made the truth hit harder when it finally arrived. Number 8. Jason Dunnigan. He was standing there when the trooper arrived, right there at the scene, beside his wife's car, presenting himself as a grieving husband, who had gone out looking for her and found the worst. He even gave a statement that night, calm, cooperative, devastated by all appearances. In the days that followed, he told local reporters he wanted answers. He wanted to know who had done this to Amber. The answer, investigators would eventually prove beyond any reasonable doubt, was Jason Dunnigan himself. He just didn't know yet that his own car had already told them everything. Jason Ross Dunnigan was 39 years old and living in Farmington, Arkansas, in the Weddington Woods community west of Fayetteville, when his wife Amber died on the evening of May 28, 2021. By outward appearances, the Dunnigans were a working family in a quiet rural corner of Washington County. They shared a home, they had a roommate, they moved through the routines of ordinary life without drawing particular attention. What nobody outside that household fully understood, what Amber herself had apparently only recently begun to piece together, was that her husband had been conducting a long-term sexual relationship with the woman living under their roof, and that Jason Dunnigan had taken out, or was aware of, a life insurance policy on his wife worth somewhere between $165,000 and $300,000, depending on which documents investigators later reviewed. He had been planning this for months. That would be the prosecution's central argument, and the digital record would bear it out with a precision that left very little room for interpretation. The evening of May 28th unfolded on the surface like a minor domestic inconvenience. Jason called his wife and told her he was having car trouble on the highway west of Fayetteville, near the Lake Weddington area. He needed her to come out. Amber, by all accounts, a trusting woman who had no reason yet to fear her husband as an immediate physical threat, drove out to find him. She was 36 years old. What she did not know was that Jason had turned his phone off hours earlier. He had done it, deliberately. Not because the battery was dying, as he would later claim, but because he understood that a powered-on phone creates a location record. He also had an advanced home security system with cameras covering the property. Between 6:22 in the evening and 8:26, that system had no footage, not a malfunction, not a power outage. The footage for that specific 2-hour window, the precise window during which everything happened, was simply gone. Amber arrived at the location near Lake Weddington. At 8:05 in the evening, her phone and Jason's vehicle were recorded at the same GPS coordinates. At 8:09, her phone briefly connected with Jason's Ford Flex, the kind of automatic device pairing that occurs when someone starts a car in proximity to another phone. After 8:09, there was no further activity on Amber Dunnigan's cell phone, ever. Investigators believe Jason wrapped a work shirt around a pistol to suppress the sound, approached Amber's driver's side window while she sat in her car and shot her in the back of the head. The bullet passed through and exited her forehead. It was never recovered from the scene. Then Jason Dunnigan drove home. His car's infotainment system, the navigation and operational computer embedded in the vehicle, logged every second. It showed his Ford Flex parked near the Lake Weddington boat ramp at 7 p.m. It showed the vehicle moving to the exact location where Amber's body would later be found at 7:07. It showed the vehicle remaining at that location until 7:57, and then it showed the vehicle departing at high speed, hitting 88 miles per hour in a 40-mile-per-hour zone, and arriving back at the Dunnigan home at 8:25 p.m., 1 minute before the home security system resumed recording. He had thought of almost everything: the phone, the cameras, the story about car trouble, about driving home, about becoming concerned when Amber didn't follow. He had even arranged to call his parents so he could have witnesses, accompanying him when he discovered her body, lending the return to the scene the quality of a family tragedy rather than a calculated crime. What he had not fully accounted for was that every modern vehicle is, in effect, a black box. Every gear shift, every door open and close, every navigation point, every speed registered by the engine management system. His car had watched everything he did that night and stored it without his knowledge or consent. And when investigators obtained a warrant and pulled that data, it dismantled his alibi with the kind of mathematical certainty that no witness testimony can achieve and no defense attorney can easily challenge. There was something else. In the days before her death, Amber had been communicating with the woman living in their home, the woman conducting the affair with her husband. Text messages recovered from Amber's phone showed her growing suspicion. In one message, she told the woman that Jason had paused location, sharing on the app yesterday. She had noticed. She was tracking it. She was figuring it out. The last message sent from Amber Dunnigan's phone to that same woman consisted of 2 words: found him. She had found him at Lake Weddington. She had driven out to help her husband, and in the gap between that final message at 8:09 and the moment investigators found her dead in that car at 10 p.m., everything else happened. Jason Dunnigan was arrested on February 19, 2022, nearly 9 months after Amber's death. He was charged with capital murder and released on $250,000 bond. He pleaded not guilty. His trial, originally scheduled for January 2023, was delayed 8 separate times over the following years. Continuances piling onto continuances as the defense sought more time, challenged evidence, and watched prosecutors eventually waive the death penalty, leaving life without parole as the only possible outcome. The trial finally began on September 29, 2025, more than 4 years. After Amber Dunnigan was shot in the back of the head at the side of a highway in western Washington County. Dunnigan did not testify. He called no witnesses in his own defense. The prosecution laid out the GPS data, the phone records, the security system gap, the life insurance policy, the affair, and the interrogation video in which Jason told investigators he had seen his wife's car that night, had driven right past it, and simply not stopped. Detectives testified that statement alone, setting aside everything else, was not believable. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Capital murder, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecuting attorney Brandon Carter said afterward that although Jason Dunnigan believed he had a well-constructed plan to cover his tracks, the truth was found through relentless investigation. He commended law enforcement for their commitment to Amber. 4 years, 8 delays, 1 verdict. The technology Jason Dunnigan trusted to help run his car was the same technology that ended his freedom entirely. And as Arkansas's long record of devastating cases continues, one case still ahead of us carries a weight unlike any other. Not just because of what was lost, but because of what the state may have done in the name of justice, and whether the man it executed was truly guilty at all. Number 9, Liddell Lee. His last words were not a plea for mercy. They were not a confession. They were not a statement of regret. On April 20th, 2017, as the state of Arkansas prepared to execute him, Liddell Lee looked toward whatever audience remained and said, quietly and without hesitation, "My dying words will always be as it has been. I am an innocent man." 4 years later, DNA testing of the murder weapon found another man's genetic material on the handle of the club that killed Deborah Reese. Liddell Lee's name would not be cleared. He was already dead. And the state of Arkansas has never formally acknowledged that it may have executed the wrong person. This is one of the most disturbing cases in modern American legal history, not because of the violence of the crime, but because of everything that happened after, and the machinery of a system that at every turn seemed to work against the man it was supposed to protect. Deborah Reese was 26 years old when her body was found on February 9, 1993, inside her home in Jacksonville, Arkansas, a small city just northeast of Little Rock. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and beaten 36 times with a small wooden club. She was found by her husband. The brutality of the attack was staggering. The community was shaken. Law enforcement investigated Reese's neighbors and acquaintances, and suspicion fell on a 23-year-old man named Liddell Lee, who lived nearby and had previous encounters with the law. What investigators gathered against Lee was largely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence directly connected to the crime. The prosecution's own forensic experts at trial described the results of several of their tests as ultimately inconclusive. A hair found at the scene was attributed to Lee through microscopic hair comparison. a method that has since been thoroughly discredited by the scientific community as unreliable and frequently misleading. Fingerprints collected from key areas of the crime scene did not match Liddell Lee, not a single one. Those prints were not run through any national database before or during trial, nor were they ever independently examined by defense attorneys. Lee's first trial ended in a hung jury. That alone, the fact that 12 people who heard the case could not reach a unanimous decision, speaks to how contested the evidence was from the beginning. At the second trial, the defense failed to call the alibi witnesses who had testified during the first proceedings. Family members who said Liddell was not at the scene during the approximate window of the murder. That testimony was simply abandoned. The jury, 11 white Arkansans and 1 black Arkansan in a county where nearly a third of residents were black, deliberated for 3 hours and found him guilty. The verdict came 1 week after the O.J. Simpson acquittal, and at least one witness in the courtroom had referenced that verdict aloud during proceedings. Lee was sentenced to death. He was placed on death row in 1995, and there he would remain for 22 years. The failures that compounded against Liddell Lee during that period are almost too numerous to catalog. His first appellate attorney later admitted in a sworn affidavit that he had been struggling with substance abuse during those years, including a period in inpatient rehabilitation, and that he had been unable to conduct an adequate investigation or provide competent representation. He was simultaneously managing 4 other active death penalty cases and had just witnessed 3 of his clients executed. Another attorney in Lee's defense chain was later found to have been dealing with serious mental illness. The judge who presided over part of the case had an undisclosed conflict of interest due to his personal relationship with the victim's family. No attorney ever requested DNA testing of the crime scene evidence, ever. Not during trial, not during the first decades of appeals, not until the ACLU and the Innocence Project became involved, roughly 1 month before Liddell Lee's scheduled execution date. In 2017, Arkansas found itself in a situation with no precedent in the modern death penalty era. The state had a supply of midazolam, one of the drugs in its lethal injection protocol. That was approaching its expiration date. State officials were uncertain whether they could obtain replacement supplies in the future, so they scheduled 8 executions over an 11-day period, creating an unprecedented legal and logistical sprint that jammed appellate courts with simultaneous filings across multiple cases, impairing the kind of careful judicial review that life or death decisions require. Amnesty International called it callously rushing the judicial process, treating human beings as though they had a sell-by date. In the final weeks before the scheduled executions, the ACLU and the Innocence Project took on Lee's case on an emergency basis. 3 leading forensic experts reviewed the evidence. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Batten, footwear examination expert Alicia Wilcox, and eyewitness misidentification specialist Dr. Jennifer Dysart each identified serious, documented flaws in the evidence used to convict Lee. The organizations filed for an emergency stay of execution so that DNA testing that the state had never done and that would cost nothing, could be completed before the lethal injection was administered. A federal judge denied the request. The reasoning offered was that Lee had simply delayed too long. Another, Arkansas inmate scheduled for execution the same night as Lee, a man named Stacy Johnson, was granted a stay on a nearly identical request for DNA testing. Johnson lived, Lee did not. On April 20th, 2017, Liddell Lee became the first person executed in Arkansas in more than a decade. He was one of 4 men put to death in that compressed, drug expiration-driven window. The 5-4 Supreme Court ruling that allowed the execution to proceed included the first vote ever cast by newly seated Justice Neil Gorsuch. After Lee's death, his sister Patricia Young refused to let the case close. With the support of the Innocence Project and the ACLU, she filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit in January 2020, seeking access to the physical evidence from the crime so it could finally be tested. Jacksonville City Council, which by then had custody of the evidence, voted unanimously to grant the request. The results arrived in April 2021, 4 years after Liddell Lee's execution. DNA from an unidentified male was found on the handle of the wooden club used to kill Deborah Reese. The same unidentified male's DNA was found on a blood-soaked shirt wrapped around the murder weapon. 5 sets of fingerprints from the crime scene that did not match Lee were entered into a national database of 70 million profiles. No match was returned. The Arkansas State Crime Laboratory had still not run those same fingerprints through its own separate database. The unknown man's DNA has not been identified. The investigation remains technically open. Arkansas Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, when asked about the new findings, said the courts had consistently rejected Lee's claims and that the evidence demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that he murdered Deborah Reese. Governor Asa Hutchinson, who had signed the execution order, said the DNA findings presented no conclusive evidence to undermine the decisions of the courts. Liddell Lee's sister said she believed they had executed her brother for no reason. The murder of Deborah Reese remains officially unsolved. The man convicted of killing her is dead. The DNA on the murder weapon belongs to someone who has never been identified, never been charged, and never been held accountable for anything. The state of Arkansas has never said it made a mistake. This case does not end with a verdict. It does not end with a sentence. It ends with a question that the legal system has so far declined to answer. And with a man who spent his last breath insisting, with everything he had left, that the answer was the one nobody wanted to hear. As we reach the final case on our list, we move from a man who may have been wrongfully executed to a case that generated national news coverage for an entirely different reason. A killer, a mother, a child, and the first double execution night in America in nearly 2 decades. Number 10, Jack Jones. She had taken Lacey to the dentist that afternoon. It was a Thursday. An ordinary errand in an ordinary week in the small Arkansas town of Bald Knob. Population just under 3,000, tucked in White County between Little Rock and Jonesboro. After the appointment, Mary Phillips brought her 11-year-old daughter back to the accounting office where she worked as a bookkeeper, because there was still work to finish before she could go home. Mary Phillips was 34 years old. She was methodical, hardworking, trusted by her employer and her community. She had no reason to believe that afternoon would be her last. Jack Harold Jones Jr. had a reason to be there. He needed money. Jones was born in August of 1964 in Ohio. A man who had spent the better part of his adult life moving through violent episodes that left trails law enforcement in multiple states would spend years connecting. His sister would later say he had suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child. That addiction had consumed him early. Whether that explained anything, whether it excused anything, the families of his victims and Jones himself would have answered that question the same way. Jones arrived at the Automated Tax and Accounting Service office in Bald Knob on the afternoon of June 6, 1995. He was armed. He entered through the door like anyone else might enter a small-town office and found Mary Phillips at her desk with her daughter nearby. He produced a handgun. He bound their hands and feet. He separated Lacey, placing her in the office bathroom, tied to a chair. Then he went back to Mary. What Jack Jones did to Mary Phillips in that office, the robbery, the assault, the strangulation with the electrical cord from a coffee maker, was documented in the court record with a clinical precision that does nothing to diminish how savage it was. The jury that heard those details were instructed to assess the facts and render a verdict. Several of them, by all accounts, never entirely recovered from what they heard during that trial. After Mary Phillips was dead, Jones returned to the bathroom where he had left her 11-year-old daughter tied to a chair. He strangled Lacey. He struck her repeatedly in the head with a BB gun, fracturing her skull. He left her there, tied up, covered in blood, believing she was dead. The office fell silent. Jones left with $280 from the register. When officers arrived and processed the scene, they found Mary Phillips where she had fallen. They found Lacey in the bathroom, bound to the chair, skull fractured, blood covering her face and the floor around her, completely motionless. The first responders, including Bill Lindsay, a chief investigator for the White County Sheriff's Office, believed she was gone. He was taking crime scene photographs, flash photography in the dim bathroom, when something happened that he would carry with him for the rest of his career. With the flash of the camera, Lacey Phillips moved. She turned her head and looked at him. She was still alive. Lacey was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency treatment. As her condition stabilized, she was able to speak with investigators. She described her attacker precisely. including a tattoo on his arm and a teardrop tattoo beneath his left eye. The officers present immediately recognized the description. Jack Harold Jones Jr. was known to local law enforcement. He was brought in for questioning and confessed to the crime. DNA evidence would confirm what he had told them, a match probability exceeding 1 in 50 billion. He was convicted in April 1996 of capital murder, rape, and attempted capital murder. The jury sentenced him to death. The crime had been committed for pecuniary gain, $280, and had been carried out in the jury's determination in an especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel manner. Both aggravating circumstances applied, but Jones would not be executed for more than 20 years. His case moved through the appeals system on the standard timeline of death row litigation, stayed multiple times, complicated further by severe health deterioration. He lost a leg to diabetes. He developed high blood pressure requiring ongoing medication. His physical condition became one of the legal arguments his attorneys would eventually deploy when Arkansas announced its execution schedule. Then came the Florida connection. After Jones was imprisoned in Arkansas, his DNA was entered into a national database. It matched evidence from a 1991 murder in Fort Lauderdale. A woman named Lorraine Ann Barrett killed at a hotel on the beach while on vacation. Jones had never been a suspect. The case had gone unsolved for over a decade. Florida issued an extradition warrant. Jones was transported south, entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder in 2005, received a life sentence without parole, and was returned to Arkansas death row to await the execution that had been delayed since 1996. In February 2017, Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson signed execution orders for 8 death row inmates, scheduling them to die in a compressed window between April 17th and April 27th. The reason was the same as it had been for Liddell Lee. The state's supply of midazolam, one component of the 3-drug lethal injection protocol, was approaching its expiration date, 8 executions in 11 days, a pace no state had attempted since the modern death penalty era began. The legal challenges that followed were immediate and sweeping. Inmates, their attorneys, and civil liberties organizations filed motions across every level of the court system simultaneously. 4 of the 8 executions were stayed or delayed beyond the window. The remaining 4 proceeded. Jack Harold Jones Jr. was scheduled for the evening of April 24th, 2017, the same night as another inmate, Marcel Wayne Williams. 2 men, 1 night, the same gurney, hours apart. It would be the first double execution in the United States since the year 2000. It drew national media coverage. Protesters gathered outside the Cummins unit. News crews from across the country set up at the perimeter. Before the execution began, Jones had written a letter that was read aloud at his clemency hearing. He had written that when he came to prison, he made up his mind to be a better person when he left than when he arrived. He had written that he had no doubt he would make every effort. He had written, "I shall not ask to be forgiven, for I haven't the right." The Clemency Board did not intervene. The Arkansas Supreme Court denied a stay. The United States Supreme Court denied a stay. The 8th Circuit denied a stay. At 7:06 in the evening on April 24, 2017, the lethal injection process began for Jack Harold Jones Jr. He delivered a 2-minute final statement, addressing Laci Phillips directly, telling her he was sorry, telling her he hoped that over time she would learn who he really was and understand, that he was not a monster. Laci Phillips Seal, who had grown up with a fractured skull, a dead mother, and the memory of that bathroom, attended a press conference afterward and told reporters, "I'm glad that chapter is closed." But the night was not yet over. Jones had been administered the sedative and appeared to lose consciousness, but reports from media witnesses inside the chamber indicated that his lips continued moving, that his chest rose and fell, that the consciousness check at 7-Eleven, when staff touched his eyelids, showed continued movement of his jaw. Infirmary staff had spent 45 minutes attempting to place a central line in Jones's neck, before eventually finding a viable vein elsewhere. His execution was formally pronounced at 7:20 p.m. Attorneys for Marcel Williams, scheduled to die later that same evening, immediately filed an emergency motion arguing that Jones had gulped for air after receiving the sedative, that the execution had been torturous and inhumane, and that proceeding with Williams would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. A federal district court judge issued a temporary stay. It lasted approximately 1 hour before it was lifted. Marcel Williams was administered the lethal injection at 10:16 that night. He was pronounced dead at 10:33. Arkansas had carried out 2 executions in a single evening for the first time since 1997. The national coverage that night was unlike anything the state had seen around a scheduled execution in modern memory. Mary Phillips's family had waited 22 years. Her daughter Lacey had waited 22 years, carrying the physical and psychological weight of what happened in that bathroom since she was 11 years old. The prosecutor who had tried Jones in 1996, Chris Raff, attended the execution as an official witness. He was among the longest-serving district attorneys in Arkansas history. He told a reporter afterward that in his career, he had sought the death penalty only in cases where he genuinely believed the defendant was truly dangerous and very likely to offend again in a lethal manner. He had believed that about Jack Jones. The subsequent Florida conviction had confirmed it. Jones was 52 years old when he was executed. He had been on death row for over 2 decades, had lost a leg to disease, had confessed in full, and in the end, had told the state he was willing to proceed. For the Phillips family, the chapter that closed that April night had begun on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when a mother brought her daughter along to work and a stranger came through the door. Lacey Phillips was 11 years old when she looked up at a crime scene photographer in a darkened bathroom and opened her eyes. She was in her 30s when she watched the state of Arkansas carry out the sentence the jury had handed down in 1996. That, at its most essential, is what this entire list has been about. Not the crimes themselves, though the crimes are real and the victims were real and the pain they left behind is real. It is about what comes after, the investigations, the trials, the failures and the breakthroughs, the innocent and the guilty and the terrifying space in between, where certainty is harder to find than anyone wants to admit. Arkansas holds all of it, the clear verdicts and the haunting questions, and the stories don't stop here.